The Final Fantasy series is one of the best known, most prolific, longest running series in gaming. It's really popular, it's really successful. So every time Square releases a new game in the series, it's under a lot of scrutiny, it's inevitably very popular, and it's also has to be considered under very high standards, because every time the company releases a new game in the series, if nothing else, it looks a lot better than every game that has come before it. These games really raise the bar in terms of production values that can be expected from games. They're really just, by now, they're so cinematic and so dramatic that few games really can compete. We've all seen screenshots and movies of it and all that kind of stuff really for months now, leading up to the release of the game for the PlayStation 2. The reason it's a particularly significant game, as if it being called Final Fantasy isn't significant enough, is because it's Square's first Final Fantasy for sort of a next-generation platform for the PlayStation 2, as opposed to the PlayStation before it. So just like Final Fantasy VII really revolutionized the series for the PlayStation, it really introduced a whole new type of look to the series. People are sort of expecting Final Fantasy X to do the same with the PlayStation 2. For the most part, it really does a lot of that. It's just a very impressive looking, big, grand production, and it really looks the part. But of course, we sort of knew that already. We've seen the screenshots. The question is, how does it play? Does it really stack up? Is it as long as the previous games in the series and that sort of thing? And by and large there, the answer is yes. It has a very interesting combat system, a lot of great characters, a story that turns out to be very interesting. The game itself is very long, surprisingly long. In fact, it's even longer than many of its predecessors. It'll probably take you no less than 40 hours if you're a veteran of the series, and probably as long as 50. And that's without even going through a lot of the side quests, a lot of the optional stuff that could easily end up doubling the amount of time you spend with the game. The game uses a turn-based combat system like every other Final Fantasy game before it. You have 3 characters active at any given time, but you actually, in most cases, have access to your entire party of characters. Early on in the game, you pretty much meet all your friends, and you have more than half a dozen characters in your team. So what happens is you can swap one character in for another, and although you only have the 3 guys up front fighting whatever it is you're fighting, you can always call someone else in for reinforcements. The game still ends if you lose all 3 characters who are active, so it's not entirely logical. Like why don't those other guys come in and help? But it actually helps gameplay a lot, because these battles last a long time anyway, and if they were balanced, to face them with like 7 characters rather than just 3, then they'd take even longer. As it is, the combat system works quite well. It's very, very strategic, very tactical. You have you get to see now the order in which your characters are going to move in. You'll see that you'll get 2 turns and then the enemy is going to go. So you'll have to anticipate what the enemy is going to do and try to get prepared for that. The Final Fantasy series is really popular, but that's not to say it doesn't have some detractors. It's not, beyond reproach. Some people have criticized the series, particularly since Part 7, for being very time-consuming. You have these really drawn-out battle sequences where you're seeing these admittedly incredible-looking spell effects going off and all kinds of things happening, but the battle sort of, some people think the battles sort of drag on, and they wish the game would kind of snap to it and move a little bit faster. Of course, fans of the series really love the more leisurely pacing, the sort of epic nature of the game. And Final Fantasy X, to be sure, does follow in the tradition of the more recent games in the series. it is a time-consuming game. It's not something you could just play for 5 or 10 minutes at a time. It's something you kind of have to hunker down with and spend a good few hours with if you're going to get anywhere, because, you know, especially in the second half of the game, you'll start fighting some of these battles that really take quite some time to get through.